Hey everyone, Scott Echo here for Modern Mythology Podcast. This is the beginning of a series that I'm going to run, a video series for Trinity Continuum Aeon. We're starting a campaign Friday nights, probably start somewhere in mid-July. And, while I'm going to start us off, there probably is going to be a little bit of rotation of GM, whether that's going to be episode to episode or it's going to be season to season. We haven't really discussed that. But the core of what's going on here is my co-host Jamie is running a wonderful and exhaustive set of articles providing context to a lot of what we talk about. And it's about the history and about perspectives and theory. And it's just really digging into all of the subject matter that, and providing this great grist for the conversational mill. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, and I'm going to take a practical approach to these conversations to be able to sort of talk through much of my thought process that, when I'm developing a campaign. So it was very important that we, of course, highlight a lot of what we talk about. And while you definitely see actual plays or hear actual plays, as the case may be, in our podcast, this is going to be a long-term effort, right? Some of what you're missing from the podcast is some of the developmental pieces that we utilize and, an example of what our games are likely like, and also how we're going to implement some of these subsystems or how we utilize the system at hand. Now, I want to say that we talk about this stuff kind of curtly during our discussions, right? We make it seem so easy, and I want to point out that I think a lot of content creators do this, where they're longtime GMs, they're ostensibly there as professionals. They're trying to provide content for you in a somewhat succinct manner, some more succinct than others. And I want to point out that GMing is a complex affair. Yes, it's accessible. Yes, we want you to jump in, join into the community. We want you to express your creativity, right? But I also want to point out that a lot of people don't really talk about everything that goes into a campaign. And this is not meant to be daunting. This is not gatekeeping. This is not me trying to scare you off in any way whatsoever. This is merely just a means to say, while we talk about system that is supporting narrative, there's some other things going on in the background too, right? When I talk about cult of personality GMing, some people are going to have talent for it, but a lot of times there's other talents involved. For me, there's a lot of scaffolding. There's not only decades of too much gaming for me to admit. In hundreds of systems, right? And traveling the country, playing RPGs with thousands of people, right? So, I'm saying that not in hubris, right? I'm just trying to give context to how much GMing I have done in sort of what I've put into this hobby. But it's more than that. I'm a cinephile. I love film. I'm a writer. I've written a dozen novels at this stage, never mind short stories and thousands of pages of RPG material. But I'm also love television and novels and it's all of that stuff. It's many years of putting in and understanding the the tropes and the ideas and like what an audience wants and needs, what a player wants and needs, thinking about all of the stuff that we bring to the table in terms of social agenda, making certain that your players are safe and feel heard, but also really serving, stories. So, you know, I don't ever want you to think um, that you're going to be able to right off the bat run many games as some of the games we run, particularly games that hang on that talent, that hang on that skill and that experience. And the only way to get that experience is to play. The only way to get that is to, you can get a little bit from actual plays. You can get a little bit from listening to our podcast or reading books. There's a lot of really great books out there. There's a lot of really great content creators. Um, we dive into a lot of them. Uh, a lot of really talented people out there, but nothing is going to make you a better GM and a better player than playing games. And not just running games or playing games, but being introspective about them, having a growth mentality. Don't approach your games, right? If I'm going to take a hard line about anything, don't approach your games with a mentality that you know what the fuck you're doing or that someone else knows what the fuck they're doing. Don't pay attention to what I'm doing. Pay attention to what you're doing, what's going on at the table. Ask your players questions. I do this all the time. I ask for feedback. I try to get feedback. I try to get a sense of where we're going, what people think. One of the things that I love about streaming games and actual plays and recording and doing stuff on Discord is to get feedback. And, sometimes that feedback is going to be mired in other people's, own ways of thinking and such. But a lot of times you're going to be able to collect it all, just like a good play test. You're going to collect it all. You're going to sift through it. You're going to say, what works for me? What's working at the table? And, the goal here is this is a skill. This is a set of skills, and this is something we want you to succeed at. We want there to be better games. We want to be able to come to tables and know that people are growing and learning and not only being better humans, but better gamers. That being said, our credo here, our sense of what's going on, lies in the idea that there are some games out there that are going to help you in your journey to being a GM than others. Games that are very loose, games that don't tell you how to play, how to bring the experience to the table, are going to be more challenging for you to play. Running Dungeons and Dragons is going to be more challenging for you to run than Blades in the Dark, because Blades in the Dark is coming from a particular angle and is providing an experience for you that by and large is more difficult to play poorly, is more difficult to mess up or to have these boring uh, pieces, because the game is sort of giving you so many really good tidbits, so much good instruction in its baked into it, right? Daggerheart, quite honestly, I think is a really well done book, and again is one of those games where um, run it as written, and you're more likely to have a great experience and learn more about your players and you and your own creativity, um, than if you were to run other games, um, that that are a little looser in nature. All right, you've been listening to me for 10 minutes. You've been looking at this same screen. Let's talk a little bit more about where we are. So, what are our campaigning goals for this? Well, first off, we want to be player focused. It's going to be player driven. We're going to use character arcs for this. The characters are going to be pre-gens. We'll talk about that in a bit. But there's going to be the players are going to bring their own style, their own personalities, their own interpretation of these characters. Decision making is a big piece of the equation. We want not only for there to be meaningful decisions, but we also want what those decisions are to be clear. For me, nothing turns me off more than a bunch of players sitting around trying to figure out what they should be doing, what their next steps are. Now, there is a difference between saying, here are my possibilities, and now we have to talk through maybe what those possibilities would be, but I want those choices to be very, very clear. I want it to be fast paced. This is an action game. We're going to talk in the rest of this, we're going to talk about science fiction and action tropes. And, we're certainly going to take film and series. And, we're not trying to necessarily make a film, but we're certainly leaning on that visual medium to fuel all of what's going on in the theater of the mind. We're going to actually use several films throughout this. You're going to see imagery and such. We're going to talk a little bit about the film Serenity, the Firefly film from 2005. We're going to talk about Star Trek Beyond. We're going to talk a little bit. There's times when I'm going to refer to things like Bullet Train, and and a few. Oh, and John Wick. I think John Wick is an interesting action film that as part of my learning process, right? Because I'm here to grow and learn also. I want to learn more how to run games that emulate uh, these this, these action sequences, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Um, we're gonna we're definitely going to separate the idea of player versus character knowledge. We're going to use that information for players to be working towards revealing their own secrets, that they're not holding on to them. They're looking for opportunities for to come out in play, uh, looking for opportunities to work towards things that they may know that that idea of suspense over thrills, the Hitchcockian idea of suspense over thrills, and like bringing out secrets, not holding on to secrets. We want this to be open to multiple players coming in and out. So this is really going to be an ensemble cast. We're going to be telling very varied stories in this shared space. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. We're also going to have a shift of power. Right now, the GM is going to have a pretty traditional role in terms of providing narrative, providing setting details. We'll play with that a little in a sort of a flip narrative. We'll be using some technological tools to send information to players based on who their characters are and such. And we'll also be taking notes and providing setting material. And of course, we're going to definitely encourage our players to read the books and the setting material there. But then as episodes go forward and as seasons go forward, we're going to be looking for players to start taking a little bit more control. They're always going to have certain control, like dramatic editing from the StoryPath system. There's certainly, going to be a scene economy, which we're going to be talking a little bit about. But eventually, we want players to be really taking the reins of the narrative and shifting some of that responsibility off of the GM. It's not because I don't want to do work, but it's because we feel that games are richer when the players are bringing in some of those background materials. And we're also learning a little bit about the technology. This is going to be the first time I'm streaming on Twitch. This is my first foray running, well, first major open foray running games in Foundry. And we just want to build on using those tools. So in the very beginning, it might be a little rudimentary. We're going to try to deliver on for lack of a better term, a product that's going to be as seamless, and we're going to try to reduce the amount of glitches by reducing moving parts. But then we want to build on that, and we want to build on what we learn and move forward. So those are our campaign goals and the play style that we're looking for. Some TV tropes that we're going to be leaning on. I am going to be doing opening and closing scenes. We're going to take a ritualistic approach to this. The GM is going to open and close every scene. It's a framing tool. It's a means to say we're starting. This is how we start every time, and largely this is how we close every time. This is going to be very episodic. These are going to be encapsulated stories. Yes, I am taking an intrinsic look at arcs. I very much, in looking at what difficulties are and the pacing of things, I'm definitely going to be looking at rising actions and climaxes and denouements and, all of that stuff that makes for good stories. But I'm also going to be hoping to sort of internalize those ideas. And again, because it's going to be in the player's hands, we're going to give them a means to really participate in that process. But there is going to be a limited number of scenes. We're going to have to get everything done that we want for an episode. Things generally are going to get wrapped up more often than not. Cliffhangers are going to be rare and special. I'm not interested in doing never-ending cliffhangers. This is about the crew, about the ships, about the grand piece, but it's also going to be about the players sitting at the table then. And I don't want to, while I want people to be invested, I don't want um, that's going to be one of the means that we're going to be able to control. Hey, what happens when someone can't show up? I have some other tools we're going to use for that, but making these uh, uh, encapsulated episodes with a very clear beginning and ending, I think is going to, while it's all going to be tied together and it's all going to be one narrative per se, um, that's our goal, right? Whether or not we succeed, there may be times that things change and we do have cliffhangers. Sometimes it's planned, sometimes it's not. Some things are going to take a little longer than we really planned on, right? We are giving ourselves a pretty fair amount of time. I'm going to aim for 3 hours, but I'm giving us enough time for 4. So quite honestly, I feel like that should be enough time to get everything in. And then, of course, everything's going to be scene based. There's We're talking about these pieces of time, you, whatever characters are in this moment, we're working towards why are they here. We're answering pertinent questions, we're communicating ideas between the characters, um, and we're going to try to make those succinct and punchy. And sometimes like part of that pacing is dragging a scene out to maybe deliver some emotional content, um to slow things down a bit, to let everything set in. But there's still going to be these scenes. We're not going to have things drag on. We're not going to have people sort of scratching their chins, oohing and eyeing. What are we doing here? Why are we doing it? And move on. It'll be a little more transparent, and we'll talk in those terms maybe at the beginning. And the hopes is everybody will sort of latch onto the style and see how it's run. We are running a space action game. While some tropes are things to be avoided, there are some pieces that are going to be pretty common. Trouble with space. This is going to be a space game. Space is going to uh, ostensibly be a character in this drama, right? It's going to have a significant impact. Much like a zombie film, the zombies are part of the environment. They're not usually characters in their own right, and certain exceptions notwithstanding. What was that great movie? I think it's called Warm Bodies, where it was a zombie film under the perspective of the zombie. It's a lot of fun. But space is going to be ever present. The characters, there's going to be a little bit of resource management going on, um, that we're going to hope is going to get put into the background. We're going to be talking about it. You're going to be seeing that. Um, this is not going to be about talking heads. You're going to see screens with character sheets and play mats and dice rolls and where we're putting dice and why. So there's going to be some of those mechanical elements, but it's generally going to be fiction first, and as such, um, we we're going to be leaning into the narrative of like what we have to do. What are the problems? Or do we have enough spacesuits? Do we have enough air? Do we have what are we worried about? Breaches? How do we feel when we get into planets and on space stations? How do we feel after long periods of time being out in the dark of space? So that's there are going to be elements. AI, or as Trinity Aeon likes to call it, SI, which is satisfactory intelligence, and instead of artificial intelligence. But this is mostly going to be in terms of agents. I like talking about agents in terms of shadows from Wraith, a World of Darkness game, where every character in Wraith has a shadow. And one of the ideas there that we may play with is other players playing your agent, playing this little AI that does things for you. Some of that's going to be GM exposition, right? Um, they're going to speak to their agents, but if I can, I'll try to give that information to the player who has the agent, so that it ends up being more two players talking to one another, besides just me, the player, and talking all the time. That allows, hopefully, agents to have their own role playing, their own characters, maybe even accents or idiosyncrasies, and give them a little bit of their own life. Um, Hopefully, so that you know when they are talking as compared to other people. We may have some sort of visual aids in terms of on the screen when that is happening, uh, and things like that. So and but then SI is also going to be opportunities for some drama, for obviously some issues and problems, questions. Who can you trust? Where where do where do the line of like just emotionless automatons versus if the when that kind of goes awry, but using them also as exposition, not only for drama and for questions and moral dilemmas, but also as a in-game reason, right? How we're talking about things. uh the beginning of this is going to be about exploration. And I don't mean the exploration in terms of like, you know, we're hovering over this alien planet, although trust me, there's going to be some of that too. But exploration of the setting. I like to see season as one that's called the learning, right? Because this is a point where the audience and the players are going to be learning more about the setting. Well, heck, I don't know who these players are going to be yet. I know we're going to have some people who are new to Trinity and new to Aeon, but we may have some old school. I'll be honest, we'll see, but maybe even some writers of that universe. And I'm looking forward to them bringing that experience to the table and like talking about it. But we want we want them to also learn, what we're adding to the setting, as well as what other players are going to bring to the setting. Again, I'm very player narrative driven, so everything is not set in stone. I don't care what the books say. If it comes to the table differently, it comes to the table differently. That's one of the fun things about the Trinity setting, by the way, is this idea. It's not quite Loki, right? But this idea of different timelines, this idea of different dimensions and moving in and out, and how quantum flux and flux and quantum powers and noetic powers all interact when you start thinking about like the subquantum space and such like that, string theory, all that fun stuff, and this idea that Trinity Aeon is sort of a suggestion. So it's kind of an idea that yes, there's canon. Yes, we're going to be using a lot of the setting material, but the players are going to be exploring and building on that space. There's going to be aliens. We there's several aliens that we lean into in terms of what humanity has already met. There's going to be new aliens, but and discovering whether or not those aliens are antagonists, resources, or how they're feeding moral quandaries. Sometimes just the existence of an alien is going to force the players to rethink how they approach these things. These characters are going to have foibles, they're going to have agendas, and we're hopefully, primarily going to use other people, other species, other situations to drive those agendas, right? And sometimes break those agendas. We're going to talk a little bit more about aliens in a bit. And then the last trope I really want to talk about is the ship as a character. Um, so there's going to be two kind of mini games going on in this. This is one of them where uh, there is going to be an economic system which I'm working to solidify. That economic system is going to be a drive to out in the dark of space. How do you repair a ship? What can your ship do for you? What resources is your ship giving you? Being sort of the lifeblood, your ability to get from point A to point B. Um, and part of the mini game is development of that resource. Uh, we want there to be sort of a push pull and investment in the ship as a character, and then how do you feel when that ship gets damaged? Not only because you're worried whether or not there's going to be explosive decompression, but also how do you feel about your ship? How do you feel about this vessel? This vessel is probably going to have SI, right? There's going to be various personalities that you may ultimately interact with, understand the idiosyncrasies of your vessel, but then there's going to be change. And what does that change mean? Do you build on this structure, or do you look maybe into others and say, it's time to move into something bigger and better? Maybe we're literally growing. How does that work, and what's that going to mean for the campaign? So here are going to be 4 themes that we are going to hit on. 3 of these themes are intrinsic to Trinity Continuum. Some games build on these more than others, but I think these are ways that we're going to mix and match them. Hope. So first off, this is going to be a more utopian perspective than a dystopian perspective. I love dystopian future and such, but I'm going to save that for a that more cynical perspective for a cyberpunk game, right? There are a lot. This is gonna be where my norm is gonna, like, normally I'm all about the dystopian, I'm all about the conspiracies, I'm all about the who the fuck are the good guys and the bad guys. We're not really doing that in this. There's going to be moral quandaries, don't get me wrong. There's going to be some sort of sense of, like, fuck, how do we manage this situation? There's not really sometimes a clear way to go, but sometimes there is, right? I look at something like The Rock, the movie, not the character, but the actor. It's a movie about 2 people breaking into Alcatraz to stop ostensibly a terrorist attack. Ed Harris is a really fantastic, complicated villain because he is disenfranchised with how the American government is managing soldiers, is throwing them into needless wars, not taking care of them when they get home, that sort of thing. It's really, really very complicated and um, complicated and empathetic, sympathetic character. But he's clearly wrong, and he's clearly dealing with elements and has brought people into the fold to help him do what he wants that don't have the same ideology that he has. And, so we're going to be dealing with more of that stuff than, say, Discovery, that is a lot seedier in the background, right? Um, so yeah, that's again, probably like more TOS, more original Star Trek. These characters are complicated, but ultimately the good guys, in terms of the crew. And that's sort of the approach that I'm looking at. And also, like, in the during the Nova Age and Scions, like, they and Aeon society are really the heroes of the story. Are really, like, sometimes people are going to make bad decisions, but they really are. We're not looking at anti-heroes in this game. Certainly not in the beginning. There's going to be some suspicions because of maybe complicated ideologies, but that's going to be baked into the characters, right? Of There's this history. Again, they have agendas. They have fears, and and again, their own idiosyncrasies. Um, they're human after all. They're not going to be cookie cutter, but ultimately they are protagonists. And also, this is going to be more about consequences of their actions or challenges. These are going to be special people. These are going to be the heroes of their stories, um, and the consequences of what happened, much less so than whether or not they accomplish what they're doing. I'm much more interested in the complicated fallout of those decisions than whether or not they succeed or fail. I think they'll ultimately fail at most of their story arcs and most of their missions, but it may not come out as they had hoped. However, I can't get away from sacrifice from my games. I want this to be about difficult decisions. I don't want this to be, while their success may be a foregone conclusion. Sometimes you're going to have failure to mix it up, right? But really, it is about the journey, right? Not to be trite, but it really is about I have option A and I have option B, and this is going to be, and it's not going to be clear which one is better, but I got to take one, and I got to follow my character's heart to do so. Sometimes I'm going to make a decision based on this seems like common sense, but we want investment. We want those decisions to be difficult. We want to see what you know that is the infuriating scene, in where we often see uh Kirk making those emotional decisions as a foil to Spock, right? And also seeing how necessarily sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes that cold calculated response is not the high risk, high reward that a situation calls for, right? So, like, Kirk is passion and Spock is reason. And it's the series, the by and large, is about that interplay, like, at its core. And we're going to be looking for those sorts of things. We're also going to be looking for these big moments, right? We want loss. Just because these characters are very experienced, these characters are very good at what they do, they have sometimes extraordinary powers. um, they're going to be faced with sometimes untenable problems and situations, and crew are going to die. There's going to be loss, and we want to be able to sit in our feelings. We want We want to feel that stuff. We want to know that they're doing this for a reason. And sometimes, while character death is not a common thing in this game, it's not as common as, like, say, games like Morkborg, right? Um, or DCC, Dungeon Crawl Classics. Uh, but when it happens, um, there's going to be these great moments when the player characters maybe make that decision that somebody has to take the hit, somebody has to take the fall, somebody has to basically sacrifice their agenda, right? Decide that they were wrong, or decide that their 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 feelings are more important than maybe what, um like, they just can't manage, you know going against their principles, even though it's going to get them a better outcome. Unity, this is pretty easy. This is going to be a crew based game. This is going to be about the crew working together. That's going to be a big theme in this, is that, these characters are often going to fail when they're separated. I'm going to, like, sometimes that challenge is staying together. Sometimes it's not possible, and you have to manage different priorities. Do we manage these priorities together, or do we somehow sometimes have to follow our own agendas? That's going to be a big focus of this game, the idea that teams, and we're all stronger together, but there's going to be that push-pull. Now, a piece that's near and dear to my heart, especially to science fiction, is transhumanism. This idea of what is being human, and how important is that, right? I'm drawn to the weirdos. I'm drawn to characters like Spock. I'm drawn to Odo. I'm drawn to, um, the the Rivers, right? That kind of stuff. Um, and so, I feel like understanding and exploring human nature is often best done through its different lenses, right? And also, like, what is the shit we make up, right? How is how is so much of the human experience individualistic? How do stereotypes feed into how we view the world, and how those stereotypes so easily break down? But then how do they fuel some of what's going on? Stereotypes don't necessarily have to be bad things, but it's problematic often when people are using those stereotypes to discriminate, right? Aeon at its core, and Trinity Continuum, uh, deals with this intrinsically. Aberrants, scions, talents, neutrals, or in Aberrant, they're called baselines, right? As sort of a pejorative. These are this idea of, like, what does it mean to be human, right? That adage, that age old conflict of, mutants versus humans, right? And this is scions versus humans, aberrants versus humans, talents. Where does normal, everyday, everyman humanity, how do they exist and survive? We're going to be doing a troop style play, which means that you're going to have the ability to play a number of different characters. You could conceivably play the same character if you play, session to session to session, but sometimes you're going to change what characters get played based on the needs of the mission, right? And sometimes you're going to play the really powerful scion. You're going to play the Picards of the world. You're going to play the Rivers and the Elevens of the world. And sometimes you're going to play the Barclays. Like sometimes you're going to be Wash. And I think that becomes a really important dichotomy of like who's important, why they're important, where their value is, how they navigate in a world where with so much technology and know-how and information and of course power, just just walking in the shadow of gods. Excuse me. Um, and we also were going to be exploring internal and external conflicts. So external conflicts, of course, is bigotry, is um, dealing. What are the dangers, right, of dealing with these? You're going to have these great characters. You're going to have this quandary of like of aberrants are really dangerous. Like there's going to be characters who are just going to take that hard line of like these individuals are too powerful to exist. Um, on the other hand, you're going to be in the bodies of some of these powerful individuals. You're going to have to understand, what it means to be uh, an individual with this power. You're going to have to struggle with what it means to be powerless. And so that transhumanism is going to be a huge source of much of the conflict and decision making within the game. All right. So, as we pointed out, we're making a space game, we're doing a science fiction game, we're doing an action game, right? What does some of this mean? Well, first off, the role of technology. So, technology is a big part of science fiction. Um, Technology is really there to allow us to reach further, to do some of what we're not really capable of doing. The core piece of this equation is wandering around in fucking space, right? um, e- while Hollywood does a good job in making space exploration interesting, the reality is a lot of times without the use of technology, and of course, you know, the Apollo missions themselves were marvels of technology. Landing on the moon was a marvel of technology, even though we, did those missions based on millions of punch cards and mainframes the size of rooms, which were all less powerful than our cell phones that we carry today. We're going to carry forward those technological advances. We're going to have fun with biotechnological equipment. This idea of equipment that is noetic in nature, that you could talk to, that can be part of your body, which is biotech, that the question of hard tech versus biotech and invasive and not invasive and when are we leaning on technology too much, when do we have to pull back from that? These are all pieces of the equation, right? Certainly there's even going to be some questions of you know woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? But famous line.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
There's certainly going to be conflicts baked into that. But technology is going to be there to drive story. It's going to be there to bring out conflicts it's not there as a crutch. Um, it's also going to be an intrinsic part of the universe. And it's we're not going to go on shopping sprees. It's not what this game is going to be about. Um, we're going to be bringing games or technology in, much like you might see some spy or action films, right? Uh, we're going to be using some game mechanics that allow you, much like Burning Empires, allow you to bring technology into the fold that, we're going to use that resources or wealth mechanic to determine sometimes what you have, and then what could you be carrying? What can you have? I don't know that we're going to have a loadout like in Blades, but we're probably going to have something a little more flexible than hard line sets of equipment. But sometimes what equipment you bring on a mission becomes more important than the equipment you have, right? Sometimes that's going to be part of the equation. I watch a lot of survival shows, and some of the drive and the long term interest of those shows is when they're like, oh, you can bring 10 of these 20 possible pieces of equipment. What are those going to be? Because, in a survival sort of atmosphere, those can be very important decisions. So, we are going to be playing with that limited resource. Uh, we don't care how wealthy you are when you're out in space, right? Or in some remote colony. So that's going to be a little more important than I think sometimes it is in other Trinity games that are more terrestrial. The same thing goes for the role of powers on some level. It's there to feed the story. It's there to explore who you are. It's there to explore how you're different, not just some of your capabilities. So for some people who are kind of used to a perspective of like powers are problem solvers, I think you should probably look at powers more in line with um, the Sons of Oak, the Mist Engine games, where think of these more as a resource you have that is very similar to, say, a skill or a connection or anything to that effect. It's something you bring to the table, and sometimes they're just it's however you're approaching a situation. Are you approaching it with a skill? Are you approaching it with a power? Are you approaching it with technology? Sometimes we're going to dig in a little bit into the mechanics of that. We'll talk about that later. But quite honestly, more than not, we're going to lean more into how this affects the narrative, how this power affects the narrative. A little bit more than we're going to dig into the nitty gritty. Part of sacrificing pacing and speed of play and accessibility for detail and mechanics, if those mechanics really kind of drive decision making, then we'll insert them, and it'll like create this interesting piece of the story. But sometimes we're just going to kind of, this is how you're approaching it. This is your role, move forward. This is what you're using. This is what that looks like in the narrative. But we're not going to really worry too much about the specifics when necessary. And I'm certainly going to honestly be avoiding looking up rules in the midst of games. That's just not what this game is going to be about. Speaking of pacing and scene economy, first off, we're really, if you look at a lot of, Cyberpunk 2020, Cyberpunk Red rather, Pondsmith gives us a lot of really interesting insight into the action genre. And that's this idea of this staggered pacing, right? Where you're going to be pacing while, yes, there is a story arc and we're working towards kind of a climax. Um, Jamie and I talk about this idea of bringing in the reluctant hero at the beginning of things, where I really want to try to push those ideas, but it's about having it's an action game, right? Where we're going to be having these fast-paced action scenes interspersed with conversation, role playing, and exposition. And those would be individual scenes. The action scenes are going to have purpose. They're going to drive the game forward. They're going to create this is action scenes, and even combats are not about who you defeat or who you uh, or who defeats you. It's they're always about some sort of stakes. They're always about some sort of consequence, right? And so, but sometimes you're going to learn some things from those combats, but they're really going to be there to drive um, some piece of the story, right? To then and to create this innate sense of peril, this innate sense of a dangerous world. Part of the scene economy is we're going to do player rotation. Now, player rotation, by and large, is going to be pretty consistent throughout the game. There's going to be times when players could spend momentum to change the cadence, to change the tempo. So the players are going to be rotating through scene by scene. Uh, and what they're going to be having to make the decision is, what kind of scenes do I want? What do I need to accomplish? Now, as a player, the GM is going to be involved in that process as well. So, a lot of times, these scenes are going to be players pursuing their own agendas on some level, but then the GM is also going to be pushing their own agendas, the NPCs' agendas, the stories' agendas. Where do we need to be in this process? What's going on in the world around them? And so while the players can be very proactive in pursuing their goals, there's going to be times where they're going to have to be reactive to what's going on around them. And then each scene, we're going to be really focusing on what's the purpose of the scene. Sometimes the purpose of the scene is to introduce some technology. We're going to have a little scene where we want to, uh, before we bring this character who is dead or on death's door, uh, you know, we there's a special piece of chin biotech that we're going to bring into the narrative, and we're going to roll to see if we understand how to use it and what it does. Have a little exposition of where we got it, how it was brought onto the ship, what the consequences to that might be if we fail rolls or we don't pay off our complications, before we have the scene where we're going to maybe bring this character back from the dead. So, like, obviously a character going down, one another character might be like, what, I'm going to take a break. I'm really wounded. I have some condition that I need to get rid of. I'm not going to be in the next scene, and my next scene is going to be two characters having a conversation over my unconscious body, right? So they're really everybody's going to be able to drive that. I'm going to lead in the beginning. The GM's going to lead in the beginning, but again, that power is going to shift later on. Combat. So Uh, I want to be true to the story path system, um, but I am doing a lot of contrivances. You guys are going to see a lot of techniques that I'm going to use to make this process easier. There's going to be some visual aids that we're going to use so everybody knows exactly what's going on so that we can put the fiction first while we're looking at some sort of mechanical device. We can make those rolls pretty seamlessly. We can hopefully spend less time talking about how many dice we roll, or interacting with the technology, and more time thinking about what is going on in the scene. It's going to be fast paced. Here is my challenge. My challenge is, while I want to be true to the game, I want to make this ostensibly the most fast paced combat game with such a robust rule system as we've seen. And the the while it's going to be fast paced, it's also really important to me that it's story driven, that we see what's going on. It's an action game. Some characters are going to be very combat focused and some aren't. Those that are not combat focused are going to be seen floundering. They're going to be seen struggling. Um, they're going to be seen, even though they might succeed in combats, they're they're going to be being put on the back foot, or things are going to be going wrong that they're going to have to buy off. Um, Even though they might not be taking wounds, or sometimes we're going to see them taking wounds and them not being able to protect people that they're trying to protect. But the characters who are very combat oriented are going to be able to take control of these pieces, are going to be able to focus on that combat, to have those John Wick moments, right? Of, all right, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to do this, and that does this, and we're going to do this, and I shoot this guy in the face, and, and I'm going to disarm this person and use his gun and somebody else. I'm going to split my die pool so that I can, do multiple things or on multiple targets, fun things like that. Um, or really in this case, so they don't split die pools in story path as much as you have complications of having to deal with multiple opponents. All right, well, I'm going to be able to buy off those complications and put stuff towards stunts, and I'm going to generally produce a larger pool of successes so that I could spend more to do cooler things, as compared to the characters are rolling 5 dice for, and barely, being able to fend off opponents. So that's what's going on there. Um, uh, Also, combat's going to be very decisive. Thinking about stuff like the agent in Serenity, right? All these individuals often are very competent compared to the people around them, right? So whenever the agent is looking at this administrator and like two bodyguards, and he dispatches them just like that, like literally one roll. He just bloop, dead, dead, uh, and chases the one guy down, you know, maybe the next roll is he's going to apply some sort of pressure point, and then he's going to sit and he's going to wait for the guy to drop on his sword, and he's going to talk while he's doing it. Miss, you need to get to work now. And then when the administrator falls on his sword, he looks at him. He's like, "This is a good death." Right? And that's so telling of that character. There's just so much great exposition during a combat scene, but it's a very fast combat scene. Prolonged combat scenes. First off, I'm going to lean heavily on the combat scene dynamic. We're not going to do blow by blows. We're doing scene combat scenes that have milestones. Those milestones being how dangerous are your opponents? Most milestones are going to be one roll for most opponents or multiple opponents. These are going to be very competent characters, right? And also, even if you're not a combat character, your everything is not going to be, you're facing a giant aberrant. You're not just going to get vaporized, right? We're going to fail forward. We're going to use the ability to say, well, you didn't get what you were looking to get. You clearly did not stop the aberrant. And maybe one of the colonists gets vaporized instead of you, and and in that process, maybe you get a condition um, that that like makes you feel a way about that process, right? So there we're using a lot more than just that they're going to be fast, they're going to be, but when when it matters and when there's a real threat, we can kind of slow that down a little bit. All right. The last piece here is we're going to take all of that, right? We're going to put all of that into consideration. And what we're doing is we're developing a game, an episodic game that has 3 plot lines running through it. And again, I said we're doing troop style play. There's going to be characters in place that players will learn about. We're going to have a little recruitment display, and the players are going to be given the mission up front, and the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to choose who goes on the mission and then who plays those characters. Now, there are going to be scenarios. There are going to be built-in scenarios. I'm even sometimes, for the sake of new players, going to offer slots to run certain scenarios that other people have played before. We could consider those basically like alternate timelines, alternate dimensions, alternate things that are going on. Maybe there might be like some fun little competitive piece here that says like whose game becomes canon, kind of idea. And so you're going to have 3 crews. You're going to have a set of aberrant hunters. This is all based on an organization. Currently, the organization is probably going to be called Aegis, but I have not landed on that specifically yet. But Aegis is going to send out these 3 groups, these 3 crews in various different areas. Some may, in fact, cross paths. You have a set of aberrant hunters. You have a set of a crew of badasses who are sent out to basically hunt aberrants. These powerful creatures, very alien, but who continually send waves of these beings to demoralize and to prove their dominance over humanity. And Aegis is trying to be proactive in that, is trying to send people out to hunt down aberrants and kill them. There's going to be, I've always wanted to do a game about a trauma team. So there's going to be this space rescue crew where there's going to be these crises, and these crises often are going to be search and rescue or just rescue missions. They're going to be put in very dangerous situations, and this crew is again hired by Aegis to be just these emergency go and help these people. But then there's going to be the main crew of the main ship, which is the other two ships are smaller, and some of those plot lines are kind of about the attrition of those ships and how can they sustain themselves is a little bit more survival oriented, where the agents and problem solvers game is really about influence that Aegis has over um, human colonies and settlements and cities, extra solar settlements, um, and how they can maintain safety and security that they find is their purview. Um, this is where you get a little bit of the caginess. You're going to get a little bit of that moral dilemma in there in terms of like, well, wait a minute, like, are what Aegis is doing for the sake of control, is that problematic, right? So I love the character of the agent in Serenity. He's like, we are necessary. And it's like, that idea of, you know, uh, we're all heroes until we find, you know, until we either die or, see ourselves become the villain. There's going to be a little of that as time goes on. We're not going to jump into that cynicism right in the beginning, but there's definitely going to be senses of like very real threats, very real problems, and the characters are going to be sent to do these missions that are more about stability, right? They're more about you're going to do a more varied types of missions where the crew's expertise are going to be asked to solve particular problems. And the core of the game is going to be the second mini game here, where you're going to have ostensibly a map, and that map is going to show where you can go, and the players are going to have the ability to say, we're going to go here. We've we've identified that here are the trouble regions. We've identified that these areas are low, are varied levels of problems and lack of stability. We're going to go there and we're going to do things that increase their stability. We're going to go to plant a team because this area needs more support while we go off and do other things. So it might be establishing that team. It might be rooting out a problem. It may, in fact, there might be a rogue element that you're looked to deal with. So that's going to be. They're all very player driven. So the players will get to decide which of the three groups they want to play in a particular episode. And then the Space Rescue and Aberrant Hunters are going to be very GM directed in terms of scenarios, but the agents and problem solvers are going to start by looking at this map and playing this kind of little mini game of like, okay, we're trying to win this sort of co-op board game, right? Of how do we stabilize the regions for Aegis beyond Earth, beyond what's called terra firma, which is Earth and Mars and Luna. You're not going to go to Earth, Mars, and Luna other than to resupply and convalesce. And doing so is going to cause problems in the rest of the extrasolar spaces because your presence is, not going to be there. What are you going to do about that? Or Do you not worry about those characters? Do you send those characters off during some sort of like downtime and send a less experienced crew to go solve some of those problems? So that's sort of the framework. That's how I'm going to be managing all of these other spaces, and how all of this stuff you'll start to see is sort of folded in. Didn't put a little image here. It's folded into this. Well, so that kind of wraps up this series. I wanted to give you a broad overview of the goals, what we're trying to accomplish here. How do we do all of this in terms of GM prep is pretty much what we're going to talk about for the rest of this series. It's going to be about 3 or 4 episodes. Yeah. So I would love to hear your comments. I would very much like to open dialogue as to people's thoughts about this. Do you think this is a good map? Do you think there's some interesting things here? What do you find interesting? What do you think are going to be the biggest trouble points? What points do you feel are going to be the hardest to implement in all of this? And have you had any experiences with games like this? I'm trying to create a framework to play a game, much like you would buy a game. This is not work that I would expect most GMs to do. This is sort of more a game I'm creating within the context of Trinity. I'm still using StoryPath, but I'm trying to add these sort of subsystems that are not just done on the fly, that are going to help us drive the game forward. Well, thank you very much for joining me in my ramblings. I hope this was useful to you. I hope this was interesting to you, and I hope that you continue to join in the conversation.